Could AI already be heading into its next winter? That seems like a really weird thing to say right now. We're at the height of the AI hype cycle. There's never been more excitement about the technology. It's about to transform the world, so we're told. But today's podcast guest, Patrick Bangert, not only knows a thing or two about AI and AI winters, he's worked in them, but he thinks that the warning is serious enough that he needs to come on podcasts like this and tell people about it. Listen on to find out more. Patrick, welcome to the podcast. Now we're going to be talking about interesting, slightly dark, ominous things, including the potential next AI winter. But before we get into that, I'm kind of interested in your background. Obviously, you are now heading up data and analytics at Searce and giving all sorts of advice about that kind of topic to people all over the world. But you've been on a journey to get to this point, and I've been stalking you like any good date to find out a bit about your background, and I think it's quite interesting. So would you give us a little potted history of your story, your career journey, if you like?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you for having me, Romily. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So I started out being very interested in how the world works. My father had astronomy books lying around the house, and so beautiful pictures of galaxies and star systems, and I wanted to know how all that worked and came together. So I took a physics degree at university in London, and eventually figured out that I like theory better than experiment, because experiments never really worked for me.
It's hard work,
and it is hard work, and you constantly have to fix the plumbing. So I wanted to go into theory, and in the United Kingdom, you do theoretical physics in the mathematics department. So I ended up getting a PhD in mathematics. And during that project, we dealt with the magnetosphere of the sun, so the outer magnetic shielding of the sun, which causes problems when it erupts every once in a while and then disrupts the satellites that orbit the Earth. So we tried to forecast that. How do you do that? Well, I figured at the time some machine learning might do us good. So we had heard of this strange thing called the neural network,
right.
Which
just for clarity,
we're talking about the
this
late
was
90s.
What, early 2000s or so?
Late 90s.
Late 90s even. So this is when machine learning
Yes.
and AI first emerged. There we go. And it was at your hands. Got it. Carry on.
It first emerged before I was born. So these things were invented. It got started with Alan Turing, again, the United Kingdom, during the Second World War. That's when AI really got started. The neural network was invented soon afterwards in the 1950s. So this does go back quite a bit. By the time I got on the scene, neural networks were already in their midlife, but they had at that time been somewhat discredited. So in the 1980s, again before my time, people went around and said neural networks can do everything. They will solve your problems. They're the most fantastic thing since bread came sliced, and lots of companies, commercial industrial companies, attempted to use neural networks and failed to get business value out of them. And that's what caused the AI winter at the time. So that the 1990s, early 2000s were the AI winter, in the sense that the funding dried up. Both governmental research funding as well as commercial funding dried up. So I did this work in the middle of that time. So everybody kind of sneered at the use of neural networks for this work, but it succeeded. I got my degree. I'm happy. I went home. And of course, subliminally, what they teach you in both undergraduate and graduate school is that the only career worth having is that of a research professor, right? Everything else is selling your soul and going to the dark side. So that's, being naive, I bought into that program. And so I became a professor in Germany. Natively, I'm German. So I had a job offer there. I became a professor of applied mathematics in the city of Bremen, north of Germany. I did that for 3 years until I finally learned, and I'm a slow learner like that, that if you actually want to apply applied mathematics, you cannot do that in academia very well. You can't do simple things like hire people and write invoices and things like that. So,
essential life skills, right?
Yes, I mean, if you want to actually apply things, right, it's going to be a commercial procedure, and you have to sign legal terms as well and things like that. It's all very difficult at university. So I started my own company at the time, and being in Germany, I encountered the chemicals industry that had a series of problems, and primarily two problems. The chemicals, petrochemicals industry is what they call asset heavy. So they have lots of physical machinery that's very expensive sitting around, pumps, compressors, gas turbines, that sort of stuff. And these machines will break every once in a while. Not very often, but when they break, it's expensive, and it can cause a lot of collateral damage, some of that collateral damage in the form of people. And so you generally want to prevent that by knowing it in advance. So they asked for a forecast, right? So imagine a weather forecast, but for the failure of these machines. So that was what kept us busy for a while. The second problem is the fine tuning of that. So each of these machines have what they call set points. These are values that you as a human user, you enter them. Mm-hmm. So imagine your thermostat in your house, right? You would like your house to be at whatever, 20 degrees centigrade. So you type that into the thermostat, and then it looks to it that your heating operates in accordance. Same thing for these machines, except that there are more than one set point, so it gets a bit complicated. Because of course they're in conflict with each other as well. And the most important thing, of course, is that these machines operate economically. They should earn you money at some point. So deciding those becomes a difficult problem, and those are the two use cases that I spent about 15 years pursuing, right? Forecasting failures and fine-tuning the operation of these machines. Now, petrochemicals companies are on the back of oil and gas, so we spent a lot of time in oil and gas, and that gets you to some very strange and wonderful places in the world, so lots of traveling to various continents and operating with people there, learning a great deal about different cultures and different people. And it was a wonderful experience until I exited from that business. And I got very lucky at the time to get a job offer from Samsung to run the AI division at Samsung, where we did some wonderful things with pure technology. The best thing that I like about that is we did some healthcare work. In the meantime, I got interested in health, as you do when you get a little older. So I wanted to contribute to that. We did a lot of work around image-based diagnostics. So if you take things like a CT, MRI scan, can you automatically detect things like cancers or other types of diseases? And it turns out that you can. And you can do that with very high accuracy and of course immediately, right? So just imagine that somebody thinks that they have cancer. You take a biopsy of their flesh, and it takes around 6 weeks or so before you get an answer. And that answer has a 30% probability of being wrong. Right. So that's a little disconcerting, right? You spend 6 weeks being worried, then you get an answer, and then you have to worry about that answer being wrong. With AI, you get the answer immediately, like before you leave the doctor's office, kind of immediately. And you have a 99% chance of that answer being correct. So you have a lot more confidence. And that answer comes at a very low charge in terms of financial costs, right? Once the model is built, executing it on your CT scan is virtually free. So things like this is what we developed for the CT and ultrasound machines that Samsung produces and sells around the world. So lots of great things happened there. And in the last half year, I transitioned to consulting. So I'm now working for a company called Searce, we do consulting professional services for anything related to AI and data. That's been my journey so far. And as you pointed out, Romily, I do live in the United States now. I live in Sunnyvale in the Bay Area. And
must be awful.
It's absolutely awful.
Yeah.
It's true to its name. It's a Vale and it's sunny.
So that's a fascinating backstory, and there's a thread that runs all the way through it, which is that you've been interested in analyzing things computationally and finding interesting ways of doing that, whether it's in healthcare or whether it's in heavy industry or whatever, which qualifies you, I think, perfectly for the next stage of our conversation, which follows on from a chat that you and I had not that long ago, discussing, well, there's maybe two parts to the next section. One is we're at the beginning of 2024 as we're talking, and what do we think we can expect to see in and around the subject of AI, particularly as far as maybe the advice you're running around the world giving to large enterprises who are considering where their investments should go in that sense. But then perhaps most interestingly, what is it that might cause all of this fun and excitement around AI and generative AI in particular to come to a crushing halt and disappoint everybody? So the first part of that question first then, if we're looking ahead to 2024 and what areas might be we see the largest advancements, I suppose, in terms of the use of AI, what might they be? I'm guessing healthcare might be at the top of the list there somewhere.
For me, it definitely is. So if we're looking across industry segments on who's done something with AI and who will, so I think retail is really at the forefront of having already adopted AI technologies for active productive use. A number of the companies who either produce retail goods or who sell them in stores, both physical stores as well as online stores, they've done quite well in terms of adopting AI. Most other industries have not. There is obviously that latent expectation that autonomous vehicles will at some point actually be real. They of course exist as prototypes, but you can't purchase them yet. To some extent, the Tesla car goes in that direction. It can do many things, but it's not quite autonomous yet. But you can't buy it from any other company yet. So that is coming, in my view. They're not fully autonomous, but they're autonomous enough for all practical purposes for city dwellers like us who have reasonable roads. So that's coming in the near future. The one beyond that is indeed healthcare. Now, of course, what everybody thinks about when we talk about healthcare is medical stuff like diagnostics and so on, like we did at Samsung, where I spoke about. But in actual fact, I think that's a very high-hanging fruit on the tree, very difficult to reach, quite expensive, and connected to a lot of issues of liability and legalities and so on. What happens if you get that wrong, right? That's a bad thing. So the much lower hanging fruits in healthcare are actually all the use cases surrounding bureaucracy. So just imagine your journey as a patient, right? It hurts somewhere. Now, what do you have to do, right? You have to make an appointment. You have to file your insurance papers. You have to go there. You have to have all sorts of numbers recorded, right? Blood pressure, and maybe you have to give some blood and get some stats there, and that they have to be put back to the doctor. You're having a conversation with the doctor while the doctor doesn't look at you but types into the electronic health record while you're trying to say something. 10 minutes later, you're being thrown out. Then the doctor has to file a prescription order for whatever you've been diagnosed for. That all then has to be recorded. The examination has to be what's called coded. So that's technical language for there are categories for the things that the doctor did with you, right? So a conversation is one code. Having the blood pressure taken is a certain code. Being examined for a certain kind of pain somewhere is a certain code, and so on. So the doctor has to put in these codes, which takes some time. Those codes result in an invoice being sent to your insurance company. That invoice is then sent to a payer company that actually does the paying, and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So we haven't talked about a single medicinal thing yet, right? All of this is process. Each of these steps can be automated with AI, done both faster in terms of time as well as in the number of hours of people they consume. So they will cost less money to run, make the entire system cheaper and more efficient, much less error prone. So all of these steps I've been through, they involve manual inputs, right? So imagine the number of errors that happen. It's significant, and then they have to be corrected with lots of effort. So it's here where I see the lowest hanging fruit of AI being applied to something truly meaningful, which will ultimately result in better medical outcomes for all of us, because you will not just get a cheaper process, you'll actually end up getting your medicine faster and your treatment faster, and that'll help you be healthier.
Right.
So that's where I see the frontier really going.
Yeah, and then of course that extends into the clinical realm as well, where you can actually, there's a lot of bureaucracy in there where a physician will need to refer notes and maybe biopsy results or whatever it is. If you're a radiologist and you need to get information into a system and translate it into maybe a wider team of people who are going to be forming a clinical pathway for somebody, there's a process and a bureaucracy at every stage that, when humans are involved, gets inefficient and wasteful, particularly with doctors typing things or writing things and so on. We all know how bad they can be at that. So I think certainly from our inquiries as well as on the journalistic end of things, you can see all sorts of scope for a bureaucratic improvement that ultimately leads to better outcomes, right? Not just the diagnostic side of things as well, which maybe ends up happening. But all of these things are exciting, whether it's healthcare or it's retail, or it's people that I've been talking to recently who are looking at how they can improve how they're managing supply chains, because that's becoming quite a thing right now around the globe. Apparently, there's a few things going on making things a little bit complicated. Whether it's any of those things, of course, AI needs to continue to mature. Now, this brings us onto the next part of our question, which is, how is it going to ultimately work if there is still a problem? And you were helping me to understand what that problem was last time we spoke, but perhaps you'd like to let our viewers know what that problem is.
Yeah, so with AI, it being a statistical thing, there is always going to be a probability of it getting the answer wrong. Now, that probability will continue to get lower over time as you improve your system, but it will never be zero. And that's a fundamental difference from traditional software. We expect software to always work correctly. And if it doesn't, we call it a bug. And bugs are almost certainly the fault of the manufacturer. It's the same sort of bug as if you put the wrong screw into an engine, and then you blame the manufacturer. And the legal situation of that is very well established, and you know who to blame. Now, with an AI system, it's fundamentally different. Every AI system, in its very nature, has the probability of getting things wrong, being non-zero. And there is no way, not just no practical way, there is no theoretical way of making that go away. So you cannot really blame the manufacturer for the fact that there's a certain probability of error. You might say the manufacturer has created a system that has a too large probability of error, and then now it becomes an argument about where exactly is too much.
Right, where's that line?
So the problem is that at this moment, to the best of my knowledge, no jurisdiction, no country around the world has a good system of laws that encapsulates this problem. Who is to blame, ultimately? Who carries the liability? So if an autonomous driving car kills somebody, who is responsible? If a medical diagnostic AI diagnoses you with the wrong disease and you get treated for it and you end up being hurt, who is liable for that? and so on and so forth, right? You can imagine a recommendation engine. You go to your favorite streaming service and it recommends a movie that you find boring. The damage caused by that is negligible. So you don't even try to really blame somebody for it. Or on a retail recommendation, right? Somebody recommends something to you, you don't like it, a big deal. But in the realm where there is damage caused, and we're talking about these things coming up, right? Autonomous vehicles are becoming a reality. AI systems deployed in healthcare are becoming a reality quite soon, and they will affect a large number of people around the world. Who is liable is a hugely important topic. And in my view, that is the next breakthrough in artificial intelligence. The next breakthrough is not technological, not software related, not cool mathematical things happening, but rather the next breakthrough is legal. And it's going to have to come from governments and lawmakers. The problem with that is that lots and lots of governments around the world are working on it independently of each other. So what we're going to see is a large number of legal codices that are different from each other around the world and that are probably not very well thought through in a technological sense. They will be made by lawyers, by politicians who will not understand perfectly what the technology is actually capable of. So parts of the European Union AI Act really are nonsensical from a technological point of view, right? AI just doesn't do that, right? And I won't go into detail. The executive order that we saw from President Biden in the recent weeks, for example, says all sorts of things that he would like people to do or not do, but it completely neglects any kind of penalty. So right. Yes, would you please? But if you don't do as I ask, well, nothing will happen. Okay. So yeah, what are the chances?
So these are two quite different sets of problems, and it's the divergence, I suppose, in that approach that's actually part of the overarching problem in of itself. Why do you think Biden's executive order left that penalty out? Was it conscious, as in, well, we don't want any penalties to be overtly present because we would like people to continue investing in work on it here, or was it an ignorance, in the best possible sense of the word, to the technical background?
No, I don't think that there's ignorance in the leaving out of penalties. I mean, every law student will tell you that a contract without a penalty clause is essentially worthless. That doesn't require technical understanding. But the reality is that on the one hand, Biden is tied up in lobbying by large tech companies, let's face it, all of whom are American, who want to keep making money, and there's a lot of money to be made. And on the other hand, if he did spell out the full story, then it would effectively have the character of a law, and he would thereby be bypassing, in the realm of an executive order, be bypassing the whole jurisdictional process of the legal system, which is probably not a good thing to do. So what needs to happen is that a proper bill needs to be drafted and passed by Congress. That's the right way of doing things. However, that's also a very slow way of doing things. Yeah, but that will need to happen.
Let's just there's the US and then there's Europe. We've talked about the US is not just one thing either. It's a jigsaw of different jurisdictions and so on. Europe is kind of the same way, but they're taking different approaches, and you might then look towards other major players here, China in particular, maybe Russia, where you've got a whole different idea as well. And ultimately, none of this really works unless you can get all of those people to agree, because the transferal of data and so on along our incredibly connected system of internet and all the rest of it, none of this stuff happens in respect of geographical boundaries, is what I'm saying. So how do we get to a place where lawyers can't even agree what they're talking about at this point, to a place where we have a global understanding of what the do's and don'ts are around this topic? In fact, do you think that that's even likely?
Yeah, so you point out a very important feature, right? Laws about most other industries effectively are based on the physical reality of ultimately the government being able to seize that company if it becomes really bad. But in the realm of things like artificial intelligence, it's all intellectual property that lives in a virtual realm in the cloud, where perhaps the company is in one place, the servers are in another place, the customers are in a third place, and so on and so forth. The developer team is distributed throughout the world. It's very difficult for any individual government to take ultimate recourse and stop this company from operating. It just won't work. They will just load the software onto a different server elsewhere.
Yeah.
In other words, we need global laws that apply to everyone. Now, of course, with countries like China and Russia, that is fundamentally impossible. They will never agree, or even if they agree, they won't participate. So the rest of the Western world, free world, however you want to refer to it, will have to agree amongst itself. And it might then be able to block bad actors in a technological way from getting in. But if every one of the so-called Western countries does its own AI regulation, it'll be very, very difficult indeed, both for those governments as well as for the companies trying to do business in all of those countries to adhere to them all.
Right.
It'll be technologically and very challenging and economically very expensive, which is why probably what will happen is that the companies will have to default to the most stringent set of rules that are out there in order to say, okay, if we're compliant with those, we're automatically compliant with everybody else as well, and then we can afford to be compliant with everybody, because having a separate software version for each country is just too expensive.
Right. And we've seen new laws come about in the EU just recently, as in within the last few days, as we've been talking, and these concern data privacy and how you are supposed to manage data and make sure it stays controlled and managed appropriately. But to what extent are the emergence of those kind of rules in one place like the EU going to impact other jurisdictions and indeed the companies that are operating in them as they're trying to figure out how to operate in a multinational way?
Yeah, so as I said, I think the right strategy for a software company is to adhere to the stringent set of rules and then consider the other sets of rules as essentially ignorable because they're subsets of that. And at the moment, that is the European set of rules that is the most stringent. Right. So my recommendation would be to adhere to the European rules, and the people that I know in international software companies do it like that. Now, the second danger, of course, is that these rules keep changing, as you said. Right. So we've had the AI Act, and now we've had an update, and God knows when the next update will happen. These updates to the laws, they result in real work having to be done in the software companies end, right? And that represents a cost. So that is not so easy to realize. And the companies will want to make up for that, so the prices will increase, right? So there is sense in the governments making up their minds and then sticking to it for some period. The update frequency of laws is much more costly than having software updates. And so I think that's something that governments should watch for, is some consistency.
Right. But one of the other things that we speculated about, I suppose, last time we spoke, which I thought was interesting, was this idea that in a slightly dystopian view of how this might all play out, i.e., legislators can't agree. Companies decide that the cost of operating in places like Europe actually exceeds the benefit to them, and so they withdraw their innovations from that particular market. And we end up with a kind of tiered global society where there are some people innovating at pace because they're largely unencumbered by new laws, and that might be the United States, for example, or parts of it. You've got a set of people who have taken a principled sort of view and object largely to some of these new inventions, such as AI, and withdraw and try to create a different paradigm. And then you've got other countries where maybe it's the Wild West and all sorts of crazy things going on. And then everyone else who's left behind entirely out of the whole thing. They're not connected. They don't have the legal frameworks. They just take what they're given, and so on. So we end up with this kind of stratified future. How likely do you think that is that the stuff of sci-fi, or do you think it's more likely that maybe even this year we'll start to see people moving towards a more consensus-driven approach to this sort of thing?
Yeah, that's the view I have, that this scenario is very likely. So the scenario is effectively that at the moment, the companies at the forefront of AI development and AI usage are either in America or China. The Chinese companies are operating mostly inside China, so it's kind of its own universe. The American companies are trying to operate globally. And so Europe is not really participating in the AI race. Europe is a customer of AI. It's not a producer of AI, right? And to companies where the European market represents a relatively small part of their total revenue, which there are many, they may, on the back of all these regulations, decide that Europe is just too expensive to operate in and will stop operating there. And I'm aware of a few companies that are actively going through that decision-making process of thinking they might just terminate the European market.
Right. Yeah.
So that will give you already two tiers. So there's a joke about the European AI Act, right? That the Europeans are trying to regulate a technology they do not make and they cannot afford.
Right. Well, I suppose that's one reason to legislate something. It's better than just admitting defeat.
So you'll have a set of countries that make this technology, that can afford to use it, that allows it to be used, and is willing to take a certain level of risk. Then you'll have the countries that try to regulate it so much that they make it so expensive that they neither make it nor buy it, and therefore kind of opt out, right? This is your GDPR kind of opting out version of this. And then you have other countries that just plain can't afford it at all. So we're talking about things like Africa, right? Where you have very few hardware resources. You have relatively few telecommunications resources to even get the internet out to people. And so AI quickly becomes simply unaffordable and therefore unavailable. And that's unfortunate. So I know that there are groups in Africa that are doing AI, and they're very sparse. And few people active in them, right? So there are countries that are effectively left out. And then you, of course, have places like China, Russia, where it's largely the government doing these things for its own reasons, answerable to effectively no one but themselves. And that's kind of its own thing. So China almost prohibits foreign influence in these areas. The things that it does domestically, it really releases domestically. So they're kind of its own thing. So yes, I absolutely believe that this kind of tiered structure, where we will have maybe three strata in the world, that is actually a very likely scenario for the next few years.
Yeah. And it's concerning, isn't it? Because I think you don't need to peer too deep into that scenario to start to be able to visualize what the impact of that might be on a country, on the people of a country. All you need to do is to look in any large urban area to start to understand what the impact of the digital divide is, which is obviously it's just a very loose term, but essentially describes, look, there's a yawning gap opening up between people who can afford some basic stuff like good internet connections and decent hardware that can process stuff, that can afford subscriptions to things, because hell, that's how everything works now, and so on. There are people who increasingly can't get at that stuff. Now, all you need to do is grow that out slightly and say, there's some more expensive things coming down the line that that maybe local authorities or local governments might go and subscribe to themselves to provide greater levels of services in the delivery of what they, how they manage tax, or how they manage their housing stock, or how they predict maintenance on their infrastructure, etc., etc. The gap, once it's open, kind of widens increasingly, and you could start to see how that would impact from the ground up an entire society. I might be overblowing this, but it feels like that's how it's likely to work. And so once you've got those tiers, the gaps between those tiers actually become a real fault line eventually that we will all understand when it comes back to bite us. Am I exaggerating? Am I writing a sci-fi book here, or do you think that actually is something we need to be cautious about?
You're not exaggerating. I think this is quite real. So there was a recent study by McKinsey where effectively the punchline said that the automation, IT-related automation to this point in the last 30 years have given a productivity increase of about 30% of labor productivity. Okay. And they forecast that generative AI has the capacity over the next 10 to 15 years, to give another 30% productivity increase. So what we're talking about here is basically desk workers becoming more and more productive with what they can accomplish in their hour of work. But of course, in their hour of work, they need to have access to these technologies, which means that desk workers in the United States and perhaps in Western European countries who do have access to these things will therefore have these 30% productivity gains, and desk workers elsewhere may not. And therefore, there is a cost and productivity cost and profitability differential that keeps increasing and increasing. And so instead of everybody kind of rising together, there is going to be further and further separation between the ability to do things of people who do have access to these tools and the continued ability remaining more or less the same of people who don't. Mm-hmm. So again, it will exacerbate a two-class society, and I do believe that companies and countries that don't jump on these productivity tools early enough will lag behind. And for companies, eventually that will mean going out of business because they become so expensive that their competition will overrun them.
Right. So these are really serious questions, and probably closer to us than maybe we think. So yeah, what would you? I'm reaching for a way to end on a bright note. So, what would you say if you were talking to somebody who is influential within legislative circles? What approach would you suggest is necessary now to try to unlock or to release the friction as much as possible to try and mitigate this potential future from happening?
So in an ideal world, I think what would happen is that the AI regulation would not happen in each country, but would happen at the level of the United Nations. That's my first Christmas wish. because that way we would get international coordinated rules that apply to virtually everyone. That is a huge requirement for a virtual technology that can flee in seconds. The second thing is that I would form a committee that is partially populated, of course, by politicians and lawyers and so on, but also partially populated by technologists. I would advertise that those technologists not be the CEOs of the very popular and well-known companies that are out there, but actual technologists who know the subject matter a bit more deeply. Right. So not Elon Musk is what I'm trying to say. Should sit on a committee like this.
Vigorously in that
direction. And the third wish is that I think this should be done soon. This should not be a very drawn out process that takes years and years to develop. What we're seeing is that the technology evolves quite quickly. It is here. If we continue to create a lawless realm for another 5 years before that regulation is real, lots of damage will be caused in those 5 years that we will spend many more years trying to unravel.
Right. Lots of work for primarily you to do, so that's good. Talking of work that you do, I'm just going to round things off now by asking what looms on your horizon and what do the next few months look like for you? As you know, you've obviously got more specific jobs and things to think about, as well as the global future of AI and civilization. But any interesting things, any places you're going where people might like to meet you?
Well, I will be in Cannes in southern France in early February at the World AI Forum there. I'll then go to London to be at a Google Forum in London. So if you are in Cannes or in London in early February, please reach out and we can meet up there. I'll continue to be at this and that event throughout the year. The work that's upcoming is largely related to generative AI. So we've spent the year 2023 talking about it. I think the year 2024 is going to be the year where early adopters actually do something about it. That's my hope, and I'd like to do that with you, of course, to try to show what can be really accomplished. A lot of things are at the stage of what we call a proof of concept. Which is a little bit of a strange term because the concept is, I think, visible all over the internet, right? So the concept is proven. What really needs to happen is proof of value. Can you use those technologies to the extent that you create business value? They bring more to you than they cost. That's a bit more tricky. So I plan to spend some of my time this year proving to our clients that generative AI has real business value to them in very specific circumstances. That's going to be most of this year, I think, is convincing people of the value of doing this and actually carrying out a real program.
Brilliant. So it's interesting you say that. One of the things, obviously, we've got a website and we publish articles and all sorts of things on there all the time. One of the things we did towards the end of 2023 was go out to all of our PR contacts representing technology companies, small and large, everywhere, and asked them that very question. It said, we're interested to know what people have done with AI this year in 2023 in their businesses in an actual productive capacity, not just let people have ChatGPT to put PowerPoints together, whatever it is. But what are you actually doing with it? We didn't run that article in the end because we got so few actual examples from companies. Lots of really cool companies who are trying to actually deliver that into other companies. We've got these tools. We think they're going to be great. We're using it ourselves. Please believe us. But no one who can actually speak to the real value. Maybe come Christmas time, 2024, we can ask the same question and get some answers, and maybe you will be quoted in some of the press releases we receive yourself. You never know. And maybe come that time, your your Christmas wish will have been heard as well, and we'll start to see some movement on global governance around this sort of thing. Anyway, in the meantime, though, I think that's plenty of your time taken up. Thanks a lot for joining us on the podcast today. It's been absolutely fascinating. All the best in Cannes and London and wherever else you end up, and speak to you again.
Thank you very much, Romily. Been a pleasure to be here.